The main focus of this particular lecture will be about some of the reform that was happening in antebellum United States. Let's start off by talking about some about the reformers, the actual people themselves of the 1800s. And most of the motivation for the reform that was happening was religion. So it was religious motivations. The Second Great Awakening and all of the preaching that was happening really made people feel differently about what they should be doing because the message that was being sent to them was you can improve the world. An individual person can improve the world and yourself just by doing good things and making positive changes. So Lyman Beecher was one of the ministers, and he said the only way that reform could really take place was the voluntary energies of the nation itself. So it has nothing to do with what the government's deciding, the rules that it's setting. It's what the people themselves are doing, and that's how we can make actual change. And so out of this, these groups together, or associations, groups, whatever, started to come up in all these cities and towns all across the country. They were known as benevolent societies. Benevolent societies, benevolent essentially just means really good. Okay, so benevolent societies started to grow, and again, they were made at first to spread the word of God, but and eventually developed into these societies for fighting these social problems that people perceived were happening around America at this time. Most of the reformers were women. It was a very, very high percentage of them were women, and one of these reasons was because unmarried women that didn't really know what was happening, they didn't really have anything set up or anything, they started to seek like kind of meaning and stuff in their lives. So they found that in the church. So they'd go to the church and they'd join these groups and they'd make friends and kind of build their life within the church. And so um, this essentially allowed them to kind of be the ones that were pushing this movement. Okay, and so they went into the church, they joined that, they worked hard in that, and then they started to join these reform groups within the church that combated a lot of social issues that were happening at the time. Some of the three main ones were drunkenness, so people drinking too much alcohol, prisons, how people were being treated in prisons, and then education, having education available to all the people in America. The temperance movement is another interesting one. This is based on the idea of temperance, and temperance is just the moderation in the consumption of alcohol. So that doesn't mean you're completely getting rid of alcohol or making it illegal or something like that. It's just moderating it, so trying to slow it down so people weren't drinking too much. So a lot of people like this wanted to get rid of like strong alcohol, like whiskey and stuff like that, and have the weaker things like beer still around. And so a lot of people thought that alcohol and the abuse of alcohol was the behavior that was causing all of this crime, disorder, poverty, all of these different problems that were happening in society. Not everybody agreed with that, but pretty much everybody agreed that there was a ton of alcohol use at this time. People were drinking very, very heavily. And so there were groups that got together, and these small groups started to come together. And in 1833, they created a big group that included all of them called the American Temperance Union. And kind of what they wanted to do was to pass laws that would prohibit the sale of liquor, so people could not buy liquor at all. Okay, and so again, this is liquor versus beer. This is that stronger stuff. They were trying to prohibit the sale of it. And so by 1855, in 12 states, there were prohibition laws that did not allow anybody in the state to sell alcohol. Okay. Other states outside of those 12 states were also including a local option laws, which basically allowed each town and village to decide, do we want to be a wet village, which means that we allow alcohol to be sold, or a dry village where no alcohol is allowed. The next type of reform we're going to talk about is prison reform, and one of the kind of champions, the giants of prison reform, was Dorothea Dix. And Dorothea Dix was simply a teacher, okay? And she was asked to lead a Sunday school class at a prison. And so she went to that prison, and she noticed that the people within this prison that were mentally ill, they were often neglected. They were not gotten the help that they needed to be able to improve their situation, and they were left in dirty, unheated rooms and really just kind of ignored, and all of their mental issues were ignored, which is a big problem because then they continue to grow. And so Dorothea called on the prison system to create more caring and respectful situation for these people. And so for the mentally ill, out of what Dorothea Dix did, asylums started to be created where they could help out these mentally ill people. And this happened in more than a dozen states. Now, overall prison reform, a lot of people just thought there needed to be better facilities for prisoners. Okay, we already talked about the insane or mentally ill people, but just regular prisoners needed it too. And they thought that really some of the things that were causing the people to be criminals were not being fixed in a prison. Okay, and so they started to switch it up and make these penitentiaries, which is an idea that the people in the prison would essentially achieve penitence. Okay, and penitence just means remorse. So it's you eventually realize you did something wrong and you feel bad for doing it. All right, and so these prisons were made to reform prisoners and make them better people. So a couple of things that they did: solitary confinement, which we see as a very negative thing now, and silence as they're working on their work crews, gave them time to think about what they did and really consider how it affected other people. And then they also used rigid discipline inside of those prisons because they thought one of the causes of the criminal behavior was the prisoners' laxness, laziness. They didn't have rules, and so they didn't know how to perform within society, and so they needed this rigid discipline, these rules. Take a moment to write out the question. One answer. Educational reform came next because people saw that all of the people that are now voting, plus all these immigrants that are coming into the country, we really needed education that was open to everyone. We need that availability for everyone. And the idea behind it is that a democratic republic can only survive with well-educated people. So people need to understand what they're voting for. They can't just be tricked into voting one way by some smooth-talking person. And so in order to have well-educated people, we need to have public education where everybody has that opportunity to have that education. And so kind of the main fighter behind this was this man right here. His name is Horace Mann. He was one of the leaders in the push for public education. He became the leader of this push when he was the president of the Massachusetts Sentence, and then he created this Education Board of Massachusetts in 1837. Then he stepped down and became the leader of that education board, and that education board went on to do a lot of big things. It doubled teacher salaries, paying them more and giving us an opportunity to have the best people in those teaching positions. They opened up 50 new high schools in the state, and then they made training schools for the teachers to make the teachers even better at what they did. Also in 1852, they passed the first mandatory school attendance law, saying everyone had to attend school, and New York did the same thing in the next year. And so really the main focus was these really low-level schools. Elementary schools was the biggest focus here. And so in the 1850s, elementary schools started to open up all across the Northeast that were paid for by people's taxes. And these taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and just work ethic in general, that hard work will help you. It was a little bit slower for these schools to get going in rural areas because not only did they not have as many people and not have as much money and all that kind of stuff, but the children were needed. The children were needed to help with the planting and the harvesting and doing some of the work on these farms. even though the reform in education and the government was talking about educating voters, they were talking about men because women are unallowed to vote. Still, many women reformers kind of took that opportunity and got more women's education opportunities for these girls, so now they could be educated as well. One of these such people was Emma Wilder. She founded a girls' school in Vermont, 1814. And this was kind of interesting because previous girls' schools only taught subjects like, you know, like cooking and etiquette and stuff like that. But this particular school also taught the normal subjects. It taught the academic subjects like history, math, literature, which at that point just weren't being taught to women. And so that was a big step forward. And then in 1837, Mary Lyon opened Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in Massachusetts, and this was the first ever higher education institution, college, right, for women. Okay. Last but not least was this woman over here. This is Elizabeth Blackwell. Elizabeth Blackwell in 1849 became the first woman to earn a medical degree to become a doctor. And she actually founded a hospital, essentially. She founded the New York Infirmary for Women and Children. And this was a place that, would do normal hospital stuff, but it was completely staffed by women. So at this point in history, just being a woman, womanhood was changing quite a bit because in the 1700s, most of the economic activity happened at home. So like all of the working happened at home because most people worked in a rural farm that was at their place of their house. And so men and women kind of were equals and worked together to take care of that farm. They had separate chores, they did separate things, but they both worked together to keep the farm going. They were both home all the time. In the mid 1800s, factories started to change that. Now there's jobs out there that you have to go to. And so the men started to leave the home to work, and they left the women home to take care of the house and take care of the kids and all that kind of stuff. And so this new idea of true womanhood came together. And this is the idea that women can be happy and they can find fulfillment at home without having to go out and make money. Okay, they're in charge of taking care of the kids, they're in charge of the cooking, they're in charge of health matters, things like that. So they're just making sure that the house is running smoothly so the man can go out and work and make the money. And because women at this point were seen as being more moral, better people, and charitable, more giving of their time and everything, they were better suited to raise the children anyways, and so it was better for them. And again, this moral and charitable ways eventually will also help to give them an argument for why, well, we'd be better off helping out other people outside of our house as well than some men. Take a moment to write out the answer to this question. So a lot of these women didn't believe that the ideas of true womanhood were really limiting them, but they really thought that now all of a sudden they were empowered by this. They thought we're partners with our husbands. We have our own responsibilities. They have theirs. We're partners, and even in a lot of ways, we're better than them. We're more moral than them. We're superior to them in that, more charitable, all that kind of stuff. And so. The fact that the women had this idea of they made a better home, they decided that had extended out into, if we are in charge of society, if we can work in society, we can make it a better society with women having these rights. And to do this, though, they really needed more political rights. They needed to be able to work in government, vote, all that kind of stuff. And so one big advocate was Margaret Fuller, and she said that every woman had the right and the capability to form her own spiritual relationship. Okay, so she really believed that the only way to make this equal to make injustice end in society is if women and men are treated completely equally. So they had the same rights. They're both people, so they both should have the same. Be treated completely equally. Okay, the Seneca Falls Convention came out of some of these ideas in 1848. Many women came together including Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were also very active in the anti-slavery movement, but this was about something else. They came together in the Seneca Falls Convention. It was a gathering of women reformers, and they wrote something called the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, where essentially they talked about all of the reasons that they should have this political power equal to that the men have. And really, this is kind of the unofficial beginning of the struggle for women's rights. All right. This was kind of shocking to a lot of people, even a lot of the women that were there. But this is what they put out as their declaration of sentiments. And it started to grow. The idea started to grow throughout the 1850s. There were conventions organized all over the place. By 1865, more than 29 states had passed laws that at least allowed women to hold some of the property in their own names. They were allowed to own their own things and property. And, of course, paved the way for more and more women's rights movements to happen after the Civil War was finished. Take some time to write out 3 questions you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any questions, then just quickly create 3 test questions you might see on a quiz or test from this material.